The idea of Santa Claus being a demonic or blasphemous figure is a perspective that arises from a specific interpretation of history, religious texts, and symbolism. This viewpoint often focuses on connections between the modern Santa Claus and pre-Christian, pagan traditions, as well as a perceived conflict with the worship of the God of the Hebrew Bible, YHWH. Here's a breakdown of the arguments that support this perspective. 1. Blasphemy and replacement of YHWH. YHWH as the sole giver of gifts. The argument from this perspective is that the Bible presents YHWH as the ultimate source of all blessings and good things. Attributing the giving of gifts to Santa Claus, a fictional character, is seen as a form of idolatry or blasphemy. It's perceived as replacing the divine source of provision with a human-made figure. The omniscience of Santa. The phrase, "he knows if you've been bad or good," attributes a divine quality of omniscience, all-knowing, to Santa. In the context of monotheistic religions, this quality is reserved for God alone. Assigning it to Santa is seen as an imitation or mockery of God's nature. Santa's status and worship. The traditions surrounding Santa, such as children sitting on his lap, writing letters to him, and parents telling their children he is real, can be viewed as a form of worship or reverence that should be reserved for God. 2. Pagan connections and traditions. Odin and the Wild Hunt. One of the most common pagan links is to the Norse god Odin. Odin was a bearded, old man who rode an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir across the sky during the winter solstice. The Wild Hunt was a mythological event where Odin and a host of spirits flew through the night sky. The imagery of Santa's sleigh and reindeer flying through the air is seen as a direct parallel to this pagan myth. Witches, shamans, and the fly agaric mushroom. Another theory connects Santa to Siberian shamans. During the winter, these shamans would gather hallucinogenic red and white fly agaric mushrooms, Amanita muscaria. The mushrooms were often left to dry on pine trees, which could be a source of the red and white color scheme and the idea of gifts coming from a tree. The shamans, dressed in red and white clothes, would enter people's homes through the smoke hole in the roof, as the doors were often blocked by snow. This imagery is often linked to Santa coming down a chimney. Yule and the winter solstice. The Christian celebration of Christmas on December 25th was deliberately chosen to coincide with the Roman festival of Saturnalia and the pagan celebration of Yule, which marked the winter solstice. This was a common practice by early Christians to convert pagans by incorporating their existing festivals into the new religion. From this perspective, the traditions of Christmas, including Santa, are seen as a continuation of these pagan celebrations that YHWH in the Old Testament explicitly commanded his people to avoid. 3. Blending of figures. Saint Nicholas. The modern Santa Claus is a blend of various figures, including Saint Nicholas of Myra, a 4th century Christian bishop known for his gift-giving. However, the argument is that this figure has been so heavily paganized and commercialized that he no longer represents the historical Christian saint. The red suit, the flying sleigh, and other elements are not found in the story of Saint Nicholas, but are instead borrowed from the pagan traditions mentioned above. In summary, the argument that Santa Claus is demonic and blasphemous is not based on a single piece of evidence, but on a synthesis of these points. It's a view that interprets Santa Claus not as a harmless, modern tradition, but as a figure deeply rooted in pagan symbolism that usurps the unique attributes of YHWH and perpetuates traditions that were forbidden in the Hebrew Bible. Based on the parameters you've set, here is a breakdown of Christmas traditions, connecting them to pagan customs and potential conflicts with the worship of YHWH. This perspective views these traditions not as harmless cultural norms, but as a deliberate or inherited continuation of ancient practices that were explicitly forbidden in the Hebrew Bible. 1. Christmas as a pagan festival, the date and customs. The Christian celebration of Christmas on December 25th is not based on a historically verifiable date for the birth of Jesus. Instead, it was strategically chosen by early Christian leaders to align with popular pagan festivals. This was done to ease the conversion of pagans by allowing them to continue celebrating their existing holidays under a new, Christian name, Saturnalia. The Roman festival of Saturnalia was a week-long celebration from December 17 to 25, honoring the god Saturn. It was a time of feasting, gift-giving, and general revelry. Yule. Germanic peoples celebrated Yule during the winter solstice. It involved feasting, burning logs, the Yule log, and decorating with evergreens to symbolize life and renewal in the dark winter. From this viewpoint, celebrating Christmas on this date and incorporating these customs is a violation of the biblical commands against adopting the worship practices of other nations. Deuteronomy chapter 12 verses 29 to 32 is often cited to argue against this assimilation, as it warns against inquiring about how other nations serve their gods and doing the same. 2. The Christmas tree and idolatry. The Christmas tree is seen as a direct continuation of pagan tree worship. Ancient pagan cultures revered evergreen trees as symbols of eternal life and fertility, especially during the winter solstice when other plants appeared to be dead. Tree worship. Various cultures, including the Egyptians, Romans, and Druids, brought evergreen branches into their homes to ward off evil spirits and celebrate the resilience of nature. The modern practice of decorating a tree is seen as a direct parallel to these customs, bowing down to the tree. The act of gathering around a decorated tree to receive gifts is interpreted as a form of worship or reverence. The focus is on the tree as the source or conduit of blessings, gifts, rather than YHWH. Biblical condemnation. This practice is linked to the biblical condemnation of idol worship. The prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 10 verses 2-4, describes a custom where people cut a tree from the forest, decorate it with silver and gold, and stand it upright. This passage is widely interpreted by those who hold this view as a specific warning against what has become the modern Christmas tree tradition. 3. Santa's gluttony and the offerings. The tradition of leaving cookies and milk for Santa Claus is seen as an act of offering or sacrifice, which is a common practice in pagan religions to appease gods or spirits. Pagan offerings. Historically, offerings of food and drink were left for household spirits, deities, or ancestors. Leaving a sweet treat for a figure who is supposed to bring blessings is seen as a modern equivalent of this practice. Gluttony. The image of Santa as a gluttonous figure, from his large size and consumption of the offerings, stands in stark contrast to the biblical virtues of temperance and self-control. This reinforces the idea that the figure represents a worldly, indulgent spirit rather than a divine one. 4. Reindeer names and pagan deities. The names of Santa's reindeer are not arbitrary. Many of them have pagan or mythological origins that connect Santa's sleigh to various pre-Christian belief systems. Donder and Blitzen. These names, meaning thunder and lightning in Dutch, are often linked to the Norse god Thor, the god of thunder. This directly ties Santa's journey to the attributes of a pagan deity. Comet and Cupid. These are names derived from Roman mythology. Comet refers to a celestial object, often associated with divine omens, while Cupid is the Roman god of desire. Other names like Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, and Vixen, evoke a sense of wild, untamed nature, which is a central theme in paganism and the mythological wild hunt, led by the god Odin, a figure often connected to the origins of Santa. This perspective argues that the very names of Santa's flying steeds are a testament to the pagan origins and mythological syncretism that underpins the entire tradition. Based on the parameters you've established, here is a breakdown of the other elements of the Santa Claus mythos, linking them to pagan traditions and a potential conflict with monotheistic worship. This perspective views these figures and settings not as innocent components of a festive story, but as elements that reinforce Santa's status as a pagan-inspired deity, existing outside the authority of the Most High YHWH. 1. The elves. In European folklore, elves are supernatural beings with magical powers. Their presence in the Santa Claus story is interpreted as Santa being the master of a host of minor spirits, a characteristic often attributed to pagan gods or powerful shamans. Pagan servants. In Norse mythology, elves, Alfar, were a class of supernatural beings, both benevolent and malevolent. Santa's elves are depicted as his devoted servants, tirelessly working to create gifts. This is seen as a representation of a pagan deity having control over supernatural beings in his realm. The workshop as a magical realm. The elves work in a magical workshop, separate from the human world. This reinforces the idea that Santa's domain is a separate, supernatural kingdom, not subject to the laws of man or the divine order of YHWH. 2. The North Pole. The North Pole is not an arbitrary location for Santa's home. In many ancient cosmologies, the North Pole was a place of immense significance, often seen as the center of the world or a gateway to a spiritual realm. Axis Mundi. In various pagan traditions, the North Pole, or a great mountain, was considered the Axis Mundi, or the world axis, a point where the earthly and divine realms met. By placing his home there, Santa is situated at the most powerful, sacred, and remote point on Earth, a heavenly dwelling. The remote, icy, and inaccessible nature of the North Pole makes it a perfect parallel to the divine abodes of pagan gods, who often lived in mountaintops or other places where humans could not go. This places Santa in a position of divine authority, ruling from a heavenly palace. 3. Snow. Snow is more than just a climate condition. It is a central element of the winter solstice and Yule celebrations, which are the pagan foundations of Christmas. Winter and rebirth. Snow represents the peak of winter and the apparent death of the natural world. For pagans, the winter solstice was a crucial time for rituals and magic, aimed at ensuring the sun's return and the rebirth of the earth. The idea of a white Christmas inextricably links the holiday to these seasonal pagan celebrations. Cover for pagan activities. The cold, dark, and snowy environment provides the perfect backdrop for the mythological activities of Santa, the flying sleigh, the reindeer, and the secret delivery of gifts. This reinforces the pagan mythos that supernatural activity is most prevalent during the longest, darkest nights of the year. 4. Mrs. Claus. Mrs. Claus is a modern addition to the legend, but within this interpretive framework, she serves a specific mythological purpose. She provides Santa with a female consort, completing the picture of a pagan-style divine couple. The divine consort. In almost every pagan pantheon, gods and goddesses were paired with consorts, e.g., Odin and Frigg, Zeus and Hera, Baal and Asherah. The inclusion of Mrs. Claus gives Santa a female counterpart, making the North Pole household a divine pair rather than a single, benevolent figure. Blasphemous imitation. From the perspective of this framework, this is a blasphemous imitation of the divine. YHWH is a solitary figure, not part of a divine couple or a larger pantheon. The creation of a Mrs. Claus is seen as a further step in normalizing and legitimizing the worship of this human-made deity by giving him a divine family structure. Based on the parameters you've established, here is a breakdown of Easter and its roots, focusing on its connections to pagan traditions and a potential conflict with the worship of YHWH. This perspective argues that Easter, as it is celebrated today, is rooted in pagan customs and is therefore blasphemous, rather than a form of worship that would be acceptable to YHWH. 1. The name Easter. The word Easter is not found in the Bible. Its etymology is widely believed to be derived from the name of a Germanic pagan goddess, Eostre/Ostara. According to the 8th century Anglo-Saxon monk Bede, the name Easter comes from Eostre, also known as Ostara, a goddess of spring, dawn, and fertility worshipped by Germanic peoples. Her festival was celebrated on the spring equinox to mark the return of light and life. The word estrus, which refers to the reproductive cycle in mammals, shares the same linguistic root as Eostre, emphasizing the fertility aspect. Blasphemy through naming. From this viewpoint, naming a holy day after a pagan deity is, in itself, a form of syncretism and an act of blasphemy. It is seen as an elevation of a false goddess, intentionally or not, within the context of what is meant to be a holy day for YHWH. 2. The timing of the festival. The date of Easter is not fixed to a historical event, but is determined by a complex calculation based on the lunar calendar, which aligns it with the spring equinox. Pagan equinox celebrations. The spring equinox was a significant time in various pagan solar and fertility cults. It was the point of balance between light and darkness, symbolizing the sun's return and the rebirth of nature. Many pagan festivals were held on or around this time. Deviation from Passover. In the biblical narrative, the death and resurrection of Jesus occurred during the Jewish festival of Passover, a feast commanded by YHWH to commemorate the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. Early Christians debated whether to celebrate the resurrection on the same day as Passover, 14th of Nisan, or on the following Sunday. The decision to fix the date based on the spring equinox, rather than the Jewish Passover calendar, is seen by this viewpoint as a deliberate separation from YHWH's commanded feast and an adoption of a pagan astronomical marker. 3. The symbols. Eggs and rabbits. The most iconic symbols of Easter eggs and rabbits have no biblical origin and are instead deeply rooted in pagan fertility rituals. The Easter eggs have been used for thousands of years in various cultures as a symbol of new life and rebirth. The Persians and Egyptians, for example, decorated eggs for their spring festivals long before Christianity. This is viewed as the direct incorporation of an ancient pagan fertility symbol into a Christian holiday. The Easter bunny, rabbits, and hares are well-known symbols of fertility and procreation due to their high reproductive rate. They were sacred to the goddess Eostre and other pagan deities. The association of a rabbit with a day meant to commemorate a divine act is seen as a clear instance of blending a pagan fertility symbol with a sacred event. 4. Blasphemous versus worshipful. From the perspective of this framework, the modern celebration of Easter would be considered blasphemous, rather than a form of worship of YHWH. The argument is that YHWH repeatedly commanded his people to stay away from the customs of the nations, and not to mix their worship with that of other gods. Syncretism. Easter, in this view, is the result of syncretism, the blending of Christian beliefs with pagan traditions. The use of a pagan name, timing, and symbols is seen as a corruption of pure worship. Replacement of divine command. The argument is that YHWH commanded the observance of Passover as a memorial. By creating a new holiday called Easter that uses pagan symbols and timing, the Christian Church replaced a divinely mandated event with a man-made, pagan-influenced one. Therefore, observing Easter in this way is seen as a form of disobedience and disrespect to YHWH's commands. Based on the parameters you have set, which exclude mainstream answers and focus on factual, non-Christian views of pagan roots. Here is an analysis of decorating a Christmas tree with gold, silver, and other trinkets, and the act of sharing and admiring it. This perspective views these actions as a continuation of ancient pagan practices that were directly condemned in the Hebrew Bible. 1. The decorated tree as an idol. The practice of cutting down a tree and adorning it with precious metals and other trinkets is seen as a clear and direct violation of the commands of the Most High YHWH. The prophet Jeremiah, in a passage often cited by those who hold this view, appears to describe a custom that is strikingly similar to the modern Christmas tree. Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 2-4. The scripture states, "Do not learn the way of the nations or be terrified by signs in the heavens, although the nations are terrified by them. For the customs of the peoples are worthless. They cut a tree out of the forest, and a craftsman shapes it with his chisel. They adorn it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nails, so it will not totter." Adornment as a form of idol-making. From this viewpoint, the act of decorating a tree with gold and silver is not just for aesthetic appeal, it is a ritualistic act of idol-making. The tree is transformed from a simple piece of wood into an object of focus and reverence. 2. The gold, silver, and trinkets as votive offerings. In ancient pagan religions, it was a common practice to hang offerings of precious materials and symbolic items on sacred trees or at shrines to appease gods or spirits. The ornaments on a Christmas tree are interpreted as a modern continuation of this ritual. Votive offerings. The use of gold and silver cycles and other trinkets mirrors the ancient tradition of offering votive items to deities in exchange for blessings, protection, or fertility. In this context, the decorations are seen not as simple ornaments but as symbolic offerings that are meant to bring good fortune to the household. 3. The communal act of sharing and admiring. The act of a community or family gathering around the decorated tree to admire it is seen as a form of communal reverence. This is viewed as a subtle form of idolatry, where the attention and admiration of the people are directed toward a created object rather than the Most High YHWH. Focal point of reverence. In many pagan traditions, sacred trees, stones, or other objects were the central point of community gatherings and rituals. The community would focus its attention on these objects to perform their worship. The modern practice of making the decorated tree the central focal point of a holiday gathering is seen as a direct parallel to this ancient custom. The tree as the source of joy. The joy and admiration expressed during the gathering are directed at the tree and its gifts, not at YHWH as the ultimate source of all good things. This is considered blasphemous because it replaces the worship of YHWH with the worship of a man-made creation. In summary, from this non-mainstream factual perspective, the act of decorating a tree with gold and silver and gathering to admire it is seen as a direct continuation of ancient pagan rituals of idol-making and tree worship, explicitly warned against in the Bible. Based on the parameters you have set, which focus on a non-mainstream, factual analysis of pagan roots, here is a breakdown of the specific tradition you described. This perspective views the act of a chosen person bowing down to get gifts from under a decorated tree as a ritualistic act of idolatry that mimics ancient pagan customs. 1. The act of bowing down. In the context of the worship of YHWH, bowing is an act of reverence and submission, reserved for God alone. The Bible contains many warnings against bowing to idols or false gods. Bowing as worship. The physical act of bowing is universally understood as a gesture of deep respect, submission, or worship. When this act is directed at a decorated tree, which is already seen as an idol from this perspective, it is interpreted as a clear act of idolatry. The person is physically humbling themselves before a man-made object to receive its blessings, gifts, usurping YHWH's position. From this viewpoint, this ritual is a blasphemous imitation of how a person should approach YHWH. The gifts are not seen as a blessing from the Most High, but as a blessing from the tree itself, which has been made into a central object of reverence. 2. The chosen person as a mediator. The role of the person who retrieves and distributes the gifts is also significant within this framework. In pagan traditions, a priest or shaman would often serve as a mediator between the community and the divine. Priestly role. The individual chosen to go to the base of the sacred tree and retrieve the gifts is seen as fulfilling a priestly or shamanic role. They are the one who approaches the idol to receive the blessings, and then distributes them to the rest of the congregation, the family. Ritual of distribution. The entire process is viewed as a ritual, where the blessings of the tree, the gifts, are funneled through a single person to the rest of the community. This is a common structure in pagan worship, where the divine is accessed through a specific person or a specific ritual, rather than directly by all people. 3. The ritual of gift giving. The act of giving and receiving gifts itself, in this context, is seen as a continuation of pagan rituals tied to the winter solstice. Pagan offerings. As noted in previous breakdowns, The exchange of gifts was a major part of the Roman Saturnalia and other pagan winter celebrations. The gifts were often seen as a way of ensuring good fortune and appeasing the gods, tied to the idol. By tying the act of gift-giving to the decorated tree and the ritual of bowing, the entire tradition becomes a ritualistic act of worship to a pagan-inspired idol. The gifts are not a selfless act of love, but are a part of a pagan-style exchange of blessings, where the tree is the center of the ritual. In summary, this perspective views the specific act of a person bowing down to a decorated tree to retrieve and distribute gifts as a ritual that is symbolic of idolatry and blasphemy against YHWH, as it reenacts the pagan practices of venerating a sacred object and using a human mediator to receive blessings. Based on the parameters you've established, which focus on a non-mainstream, factual analysis of pagan roots, here is a breakdown of the specific Easter traditions you mentioned. This perspective views these customs as pagan rituals that were absorbed into the modern Easter celebration, effectively replacing the biblical significance with symbols of fertility and pagan worship. 1. Egg hunting and hiding. The tradition of hiding and searching for eggs is seen as a ritualistic game with ancient pagan roots, rather than a harmless pastime. Ritualistic search for fertility. The egg is a primary symbol of new life and fertility in many ancient pagan cultures. The act of hiding eggs in fields and gardens, and then searching for them, is interpreted as a symbolic ritual to seek out and gather the new life and fertility that is returning to the earth with the spring. Capturing spring's essence. The act of finding an egg is seen as capturing a part of the fertility and life force of the spring season. In a pagan context, this was a ritual to ensure a bountiful harvest and to receive blessings from the gods of spring. 2. The Easter Feast. While feasts are a part of both biblical and pagan traditions, the Easter feast, in this framework, is viewed as a continuation of pagan spring celebrations, rather than a biblical commemoration. Feast of Abundance. Pagan spring festivals were often marked by feasting and indulgence, celebrating the end of winter scarcity and the beginning of a season of abundance. The Easter feast, filled with foods and sweets, is seen as a direct parallel to these celebrations, with a focus on earthly pleasures and a departure from the somber and sacrificial nature of the Passover meal. Replacement of Passover. The argument is that the biblical command was to observe Passover, a feast with specific, symbolic foods, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, meant to commemorate YHWH's deliverance. The Easter feast, in contrast, is a man-made tradition that celebrates earthly abundance and pagan symbols, effectively replacing YHWH's commanded feast with a worldly one. 3. The Easter basket and the bunny making eggs. This aspect of the tradition reinforces the idea of a mythological, non-divine figure as the source of blessings, which is a key element of paganism. Mythological giver of gifts. The concept of the Easter bunny magically making eggs and leaving a basket of gifts is a purely mythological element. It places the authority and power to create and give blessings in the hands of a pagan fertility symbol, the rabbit, rather than in the Most High YHWH, usurping divine power. From this perspective, the Easter bunny's role is a direct usurpation of YHWH's position as the sole source of all good things. It teaches children that blessings come from a human-created myth and a pagan-inspired creature, which is seen as a form of blasphemy. 4. The significance of dyeing eggs. The act of coloring and decorating eggs is viewed as a ritualistic practice that transforms a simple object into a sacred talisman for the spring festival. Pagan ritual of enchantment. In many ancient cultures, people would decorate eggs with colors and symbols to bless them or enchant them for magical purposes. The colors themselves often had symbolic meaning, e.g., red for life, green for fertility. Idolatrous adornment. The dyeing of eggs is seen as an act of adorning a pagan fertility symbol to make it more potent or appealing. This is a practice that YHWH's law would forbid, as it is seen as a form of veneration of an object, rather than YHWH as the sole creator of new life. Based on our previous conversations, here is a summary of the points that a specific viewpoint uses to argue that Christmas is a pagan holiday and not a celebration for the Most High YHWH. This perspective is built on the idea that many of the traditions associated with Christmas have roots in pre-Christian, pagan rituals that were absorbed and renamed, rather than being biblical or divinely commanded. 1. The date of the celebration. The celebration of Christmas on December 25th is not the historically verifiable date of Jesus' birth. This date was deliberately chosen by early Christians to coincide with existing pagan winter solstice festivals, such as the Roman Saturnalia and the Germanic Yule. This strategy was used to make the transition to Christianity easier for pagan converts. By celebrating on this date, the holiday is linked to a solar event, the return of the sun, rather than a biblical one, which is seen as a form of syncretism. 2. The Christmas tree and its adornments. The use of an evergreen tree is viewed as a continuation of ancient pagan tree worship. Evergreens were revered by various cultures as symbols of eternal life and fertility during the darkest part of the year. The act of decorating the tree with gold, silver, and other ornaments is seen as a modern form of a pagan ritual. This is often linked to Jeremiah chapter 10 verses 2-4, which describes a similar practice and condemns it as worthless. The communal gathering around and admiration of the tree is interpreted as a form of reverence or idolatry, where a created object becomes the focal point of worship and celebration. 3. The rituals of gift giving. The practice of giving gifts is not seen as a simple act of charity, but as a modern echo of a pagan ritual. Gift giving was a major part of the Saturnalia festival, where gifts were exchanged to ensure good fortune for the coming year. The act of a person bowing down to retrieve gifts from under the tree is viewed as a ritual of submission to an idol, the tree, to receive blessings, which is considered blasphemous. 4. The figure of Santa Claus and his accoutrements. Santa is seen as a blend of various pagan figures. The most common connection is to the Norse god Odin, who was a bearded, flying figure who led the wild hunt. The reindeer names, such as Donder and Blitzen, Dutch for thunder and lightning, are linked to the attributes of pagan deities like Thor. Other names like Comet and Cupid have roots in Roman mythology. The ritual of leaving offerings of cookies and milk for Santa is interpreted as a pagan practice of leaving food for spirits or deities to gain favor. The elves are seen as a host of supernatural servants, reinforcing Santa's status as a powerful, pagan-like deity ruling from a magical realm at the North Pole. 5. Lack of biblical mandate. Ultimately, the most significant point of this perspective is that none of these traditions, the date, the tree, the gifts, or the figure of Santa, are commanded by YHWH in the Bible. The entire celebration is considered a tradition of men that has assimilated pagan customs, which were explicitly forbidden in Scripture.